Hello, my name is Mariana Zecchini, and I would like to start off by thanking Claudia for having me today and for allowing me to virtually present this research. Today, I will be talking about the research my team and I did on a sample of skeletons from Petriplatz. The precise time, the original location, and the processes involved in the creation of Germany's capital, Berlin, are still unknown due to a lack of surviving documents. As such, archaeology and bioarchaeology play a critical role in understanding the people who lived in medieval Berlin. The goal of this project was to identify what the early inhabitants of Berlin were eating using stable isotope analysis, and to understand diet variation among males and females interred before and after the Black Death. For much of the medieval period, which overall spans between 500 and 1500 AD according to historians, many of the people of Europe were eating beef, sheep, goat, chicken, pork, and grains. Bread and gruel were the main cereal products eaten during the High Middle Ages, which according to historians is roughly 1000 to 1300 AD. Medieval Europe, however, was not monolithic in culture or in diet. Differences in climate, terrain, and soil, and variations in class, religion, and ethnicity meant that diet varied from region to region, even within Germany. According to medieval dietetic literature, in the 14th century, rich Germans were eating white bread and drinking wine, poor Germans were eating coarse bran bread, and many people were eating cheese soup, perch, and various fruit dishes. Additionally, religious food taboos prohibited the consumption of meat, fowl, lard, eggs, and dairy on Fridays and Saturdays, church holidays, and during Lent, which altogether amounted to about 1/3 of the calendar year. Christian families that could not afford to substitute fish for meat consumed beans, bread, and lentils instead. Due to the decline in human population following the Black Death, some German land reverted to pasture and more animals were raised, making animal protein a more common component of the post-Black Death diet. In sum, both primary and secondary historical sources suggest that prior to the Black Death, the German population was primarily eating wheat, legumes, and fish, while afterwards they were eating more meat from terrestrial animals. Because the change in dietary resources in medieval Germany is only vaguely understood from historical sources, the analysis of human skeletons offered the only opportunity to investigate this trend at the level of individual people and the typical foods they consumed. The Black Death spread throughout Europe beginning in 1347 and drastically altered European demography, societies, and economies. Historians estimate that between 25 and 45 million people, or roughly 33 to 60% of Europe's population, died during the Black Death from a combination of primary mortality, which would be the Yersinia pestis infection, and secondary mortality from exposure, starvation, dehydration, and opportunistic respiratory infections. The Black Death resulted in altered diversity and availability of dietary resources across the European continent. For example, secondary historical sources suggest that in Germany, less wheat and oats were planted in the decades after the Black Death due to the lower animal and human populations, while more vetches and barley were planted. In order to research diet, we use stable isotope analysis. Isotopes are variants of a given element that differ in the number of neutrons in the nucleus and therefore their atomic weight. For this project, we analyzed carbon and nitrogen isotopes. Analysis of carbon isotopes from human bone helps to reveal what types of plants were being consumed, such as wheat, rice, and potatoes, which are C3 plants, or millet and corn, which are C4 plants. Overall, if an individual was eating mostly C3 foods, their carbon collagen value would be lower than if they were eating mostly C4 foods. Nitrogen isotopes are used in conjunction with carbon isotopes to create a more complete picture of what people were eating. Nitrogen isotopes allow archaeologists to distinguish between diets based on marine or terrestrial animals, as well as other protein sources such as bean or vegetarian-based diets. Individuals subsisting on a mostly marine diet will have a higher nitrogen values than someone eating a diet composed of mostly terrestrial resources. As previously stated, the goal of this project was to understand what the individuals buried at Petriplatz were eating in order to learn about the diet of the early inhabitants of Berlin. We focused on two main research questions. One, what were the people buried at Petriplatz eating? And two, did diet change following the Black Death? and if so, how? The sample that we used in this study was excavated from the cemetery at St. Peter's Church in what today is called Petriplatz. Rib samples were taken for isotope analysis from 66 adults. Ribs are bones that turn over more frequently in the skeleton, and therefore they allow archaeologists to understand diet up to 2 to 5 years before death. Since only 66 samples were obtained from over 3,000 skeletons, we do understand that this is a preliminary study. Individuals were chosen using a stratified sampling process to capture both sexes and a range of adult ages from 3 chronological periods. The pre-plague period, which we categorized as 1100 to 1315 AD, the post-plague period, which we categorized as 1400 to 1700 AD, as well as an intermediate period, which included individuals with a date range that overlaps with the Black Death. Age at death and sex were estimated by Natasha Powers in Berlin using Museum of London archaeology methods. We were able to analyze collagen from 60 out of the 66 individuals. Isotope analysis shows that the individuals at Petriplatz ate an omnivorous diet consisting of C3 plants and terrestrial animal protein. We analyzed the sample for differences between sexes and over time and found no significant sex-related differences between the carbon isotopes. However, there are significant temporal differences in nitrogen values between the pre-Black Death adults and the post-Black Death adults. The increase in nitrogen values following the Black Death likely indicates an increased consumption of animal protein. We also investigated sex-specific differences in the pre- and post-plague periods. We found a significant increase in nitrogen values for females, which likely indicates the increased consumption of animal protein following the Black Death. There is also an increase in nitrogen values for males, however, it is not significant. When looking at the sex-specific differences in the pre-plague period, males have significantly higher average nitrogen values than do females, with males having an average nitrogen value of 11.8 per mil and females at 11 per mil. Overall, it can be interpreted that males were eating proportionally more protein from higher trophic levels, likely animal meat and some amount of fish, than females were before the Black Death, and that everyone was eating proportionally more animal or fish protein following the Black Death. We began this project with the hypothesis that adults' dietary isotopes would shift following the Black Death. This is based on historical sources that suggest an increase in consumption of animal protein following the pandemic, due in part to the lower human population relative to livestock. Based on the sample of adults from Petriplatz, we found that both sexes seem to have been eating more protein following the Black Death. One possible explanation for this shift is economics. The increase in the ratio of domesticated farm animals to people following the Black Death could explain the higher nitrogen values in the post-plague sample. If this is true, however, we have to assume that medieval Germans were consuming more meat from obligate carnivores or omnivores who display higher trophic levels, which would therefore explain the increase in nitrogen values following the Black Death. A second explanation for the increase in nitrogen values over time at Petriplatz could relate to an increase in fish consumption, possibly linked to religious taboos. Freshwater fish consumption is usually identified by high nitrogen values and low carbon values, and the Petriplatz adults do exhibit this pattern. Since terrestrial meat consumption was prohibited on religious holy days that made up about 1/3 of the calendar year, it is possible that Petriplatz adults were substituting fish for terrestrial meat in their diets. This would have been easy to do as Berlin is located on the Spree River, which is home to a variety of freshwater fish species. Additionally, cod and herring, 2 examples of freshwater fish, were traded throughout Europe in the 14th century. Since Berlin is not near a port, it is also likely that adults participated in the fish trade, consuming whatever resources were available to them and affordable. It is important to note, however, that the post-plague sample dates range from 1400 to 1699 AD. While an increased consumption of meat seems to be a trend that persisted in Berlin and Cologne following the Black Death, factors such as famine, war, and repeated plague outbreaks may have also affected subsequent populations, and more research needs to be done on this. The goal of this study was to understand the diet of the people buried at Petriplatz and if and how it differed as a result of the Black Death. We found that the people buried at Petriplatz were eating a diet consisting of C3 plants and terrestrial animal meat before the Black Death, and that after the pandemic, they were eating more animal meat. This coincides with historical evidence that suggests the same thing and allows us to understand how the inhabitants of Berlin responded to one of the worst pandemics in history. As more data on the skeletons at Petriplatz become available, there are many opportunities for future research. Additional research on this population should include a larger sample size to create a more precise picture of diet in medieval Berlin, as well as a more equal number of pre- and post-plague skeletons. In addition to more individuals and more precise date ranges, a distinction based on socioeconomic class, if possible, should be noted. Historical sources indicate that German rich and German poor ate slightly different things, making social class a possible explanation for observed dietary differences. Since few historical records survive from the medieval period in Berlin, archaeological and bioarchaeological analyses are crucial in understanding the history of the city. This study is the first paleodietary isotopic study of the skeletons at Petriplatz and one of the few isotopic studies done in medieval Germany. The information gleaned from this project allows Berlin to be put in context with other contemporaneous European capitals. As more data is gathered from the skeletons at Petriplatz, the early history of Berlin will be known by its citizens and the world. Thank you so much to these individuals and institutions that help make this research possible. I really love this project, and so I would love it if anybody has any questions. Please feel free to email me at my email below. Thank you so much.